good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the edisi 2020 Auditorium. And also for those who are joining us via Zoom, warm welcome to you all. And what we're discussing is a very critical question. Why governments can be think long term and what can be done about it. So for those us who participating in public policy or Indonesian public policy agenda, or even observe, so this question hits very close to us. So we are currently navigating in massive grand study or grand design of Indonesia Emas 2045, All Golden Indonesia 2045. Yet we are seeing tension between the short-term policies due to the electoral terms in every 5 years, and also we have also the long-term plan like for RPJM and RPJPN and so on and so forth. So I think you as a researcher who mostly research about innovative policy making and through the comparative agenda, I think you are helping us to unpack this problem mostly because of our perhaps political system or administrative agendas or even the shifting through administrative cycles that mostly hurts us policy making. Yeah. I think without further ado, I am asking you to open the discussion, please. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here in Jakarta. As I mentioned before to our esteemed host, it's my first time here in Jakarta, in Indonesia, and at UI, and I'm really delighted to be here. I would like to thank our host for the wonderful welcome that Dr. David McGuinness, Dr. Kiji Sagin, and I had, and we very much look forward to continuing our collaboration between the University of Melbourne and the University of Indonesia. I will now do the very usual thing, which is like sharing my screen on Zoom. Hopefully this will work so that everyone can have a look at the slides. There are always technical issues, but these ones are on my end. Share. This is working, I believe. I'll just click allow right here. There you go. We can start now. So as mentioned, the title of this lecture is Why Governments Can't Think Long Term and What Can Be Done About It. I hope that you did not attend this session thinking that we're going to solve all the problems in the world. This is not the purpose of this lecture, but the purpose is to talk about innovative solutions to try and solve a long-standing problem that has been ongoing across the world. It's not only here in Indonesia, it's a case in Europe, it's a case in Australia, it's a case in the United States, in America, Africa, you name it, it's a global issue. And it's a problem that I've been focusing on for the past 10 years of my career. And after working on multiple projects focusing on the future of social policy, on how we can learn lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic, and most recently on how people think long-term and think that the governments around the world should play a role in favoring long-term policymaking, I've decided to start working on a book, which is literally entitled Why Governments Can't Think Long-Term and What Can Be Done About It. This is the very first time also that I give a public lecture on the content of this book, so I very much look forward to your questions. And I can tell you already that this public lecture is going to stay for long with me and will also shape, I'm sure, the content of this book once I receive the proofs from the publisher. I would also like to acknowledge that most of this work has been conducted on the land of the Wurundjeri people, the traditional owners of the land where I work, and I would like to pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So let's just start with a little bit of an exercise altogether here in the room and online. Just imagine for a moment that you are in charge, that you are a minister, and you're facing a dilemma. a very basic choice between two options. Option one is deemed the popular choice, which is to cut taxes. Voters will be very happy. They will have more money in their pocket. They have to pay less taxes to the government. And that will almost guarantee you to win the next election. On the other hand, you can go for option B, which is deemed by many as the right choice. However, that may be quite costly from a personal, professional perspective. You decide, instead of cutting taxes, to invest in climate infrastructure. However, the benefits will only be felt 20 years from now, after you've left office. And this decision might be quite unpopular, and that will cost you your place in office. Which option would you go for? So let's just have a show of hands quickly in the room. Who would go for option A? Can you raise your hand? Not that many people. Is everyone thinking long term? Okay, there you go. We have a little bit of a nuance. That's good. Who would go for option B? Of course, it's not because it says the right choice that I expect all of you to go for option B. There's a bit of a bias there. No social pressure whatsoever. So the thing is that most politicians nowadays go for option A, obviously, which is cutting taxes and not favoring the long run, because there are a series of systemic issues that prevent them from implementing long-term policies. Another element of interaction in this lecture, I would like to ask you to take your phone out and scan this QR code, or join us on polef.com/UI talk. And I'll just ask you two questions, and we're going to reflect on this for the rest of this public lecture. The first question that should appear on your screen when you scan this QR code is, which issue do you believe is most important right now in our society, so in Indonesia? What is the number one issue that the Indonesian society faces? And we're going to have a look at your results as I pull them on the screen. So I'll give you a little bit of time. Also, for those of you who are online, you can still scan the QR code and contribute. So corruption seems to be like the number one issue. This is also a way for me to collect data, I forgot to mention. So quite a lot of issues. I see corruption, education, inequality, poverty, integrity coming as very popular issues. Food appears as well quite a few times. Mismanagement, inconsistency, accountability. So quite a lot of challenges indeed, which is very common as well. Whenever I ask this question across multiple audiences around the world, Australia, Europe and all, I get quite a lot of these comments. So thank you very much for contributing to this. I'm now going to ask you the next question for the sake of time, which is basically the same, but in 25 years. Which issue do you think will be the main challenge faced by the Indonesian society in 25 years' time? And let's see what results come up. Climate already appears as the most popular answer. Poverty. Energy. Population, which is probably relating to population growth, aging population as well, I suspect. Sustainability. AI, artificial intelligence. Health. So we see quite of a different picture already emerging here. with corruption still being present, of course, as an issue to be faced in 25 years' time. But here directly, the focus shifts. And that's a trend that we see when we ask the same question to respondents. And today, in the next slides, I'm going to show you the results of a survey that I conducted in 10 countries with over 15,000 respondents, representative of the population of these 10 countries, that demonstrate a fairly similar picture, but also that citizens want to give agency to government to deal with long-term policy issues. So thank you very much for playing the game here. And it gives us a bit of an idea of what the audience thinks on these matters. So let's start with the most obvious matter that was already briefly mentioned in the opening remarks, which is the so-called election trap. That's the core, the fundamental problem that all societies, all democracies face. Democracies operate with a short electoral term. Here in Indonesia, it is 5 years for a presidential election. In Australia, it's even shorter, it's 3 years. Imagine in 3 years what you can do to implement long-term change. Basically, very little. And an election cycle is generally operates like this. You have year 1 and 2, which is the so-called honeymoon period, where there is a victory for a political party. There's the implementation of a new government agenda or the continuity of the previous agenda. Then in year 3, hard choices tend to be avoided when it comes to making or breaking decisions that will have a long-term impact. Year 4, or the final year before the end of the election term, focuses on campaign. So you start implementing policies that will be popular with the voters, or you will just start making promises on what is going to happen if you are being re-elected, and then the cycle repeats over and over again. The benefits keep on being delayed. The payoff when it comes to implementing long-term public policies arrives long after the next election, and that leads politicians to avoid making decisions to implement long-term policy reforms. And of course, if you go for the option of going for long-term policies, the opponents will exploit this decision. They will tell you that as you are in power, you make citizens pay for nothing, that citizens will not have, see the result of what the government is trying to do. And a lot of political philosophers who have focused on this electoral trap said that there's a responsibility of governments all around the world to actually cater to their own voters rather than to cater to future generations. The trade-off, of course, is that if you don't think about future generations, then you're just delaying a problem and you don't have a sense of responsibility towards the future of humanity, more broadly speaking as well. Another problem that very often happens, and we've seen this especially over the past decade, is that we live in an era of crisis, the crisisification of society. Starting in the late 2000s with the global financial crisis, subsequently followed by a wide range of different climate crises, societal crises all around the world, wars going on, pandemics going on, earthquakes, disasters, and these crises require immediate response. Emergency budgets are mobilized, the media really focuses on this matter, and there is a strong public demand to have visible leadership. At the same time, in the background operates what we call creeping crises. Think of climate change, think of aging population, think of social inequality, think of emerging technologies such as the rise of artificial intelligence. These are not crises that appear from one day to another. They slowly creep into our society. But they also need public action. We all agree. It's not a single triggering event. The cost can always be postponed. You can always decide to delay intervention to tackle these issues. But it's also easy for the opponents to downplay. And the political payoff is near zero because it might risk costing you your spot in the office. And it's something that has been really well put by the now Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney, who was back then governor of the Bank of England. He called it the tragedy of the horizon. It's a problem that is well recognized among politicians, although very few have had the courage to put it into words like Marconi did. He mentioned that the catastrophic impacts of climate change, in this case, will be felt beyond the traditional horizons of most actors, and that we have a sense of responsibility as policymakers, as public servants as well, to cater to the future. Politicians will generally operate on the 3 to 5 years political cycle, electoral cycle, as we've already established. The central banks operate on business cycles that are even shorter, 1 to 2 years, and in general, they have to make decisions on, say, interest rates to respond to political or emerging clear-cut crises, such as like the war in Iran, as we've seen recently. But at the same time, climate damage will be felt in 20 to 100 years beyond everyone's horizon. And that's the issue that Marconi tried to address in his address in 2015. Political discourse also tries to tackle issues with like immediate crises with short-sighted answers that will have long-lasting problems. So I did mention earlier about the global financial crisis of 2008 and 2009. One dominant response that took place across Europe and possibly in other regions of the world as well was to implement austerity measures. So basically cutting down government spending because it was going to be too expensive, and it was mentioned by politicians in their political discourse as absolutely necessary to sustain the state, to make sure that the state does not collapse completely. The problem is that austerity has long-term implications that will be costly for the future and for future generations as well. Austerity is about the short term, like a stopgap to manage an economic crisis, but the long-term consequences can be absolutely catastrophic in terms of unemployment, in terms of lower growth, in terms of social inequalities, but also in some cases, emigration. I did work quite a bit in the mid-2010s on these matters and the consequence of austerity measures implemented across Europe by asking citizens and conducting some interviews with public servants on whether they believe that austerity was worth it. And the answer in short is no. Citizens felt disillusioned. They felt that austerity measures led to them to distrust politicians even further. And at the same time, public servants realized that even though there was no other choice because it was part of the political agenda, now they still have to pay for the decisions that were made back in the late 2000s. And that created like serious issues when it comes to resuming the delivery of benefits and services for the society. So let's go a little bit further in the diagnosis, and that's where I can start actually talking about the survey that I conducted in 2024 across 10 countries. When it comes to public attitudes, we see the same kind of phenomenon that we see with politicians, which is that the further we think in time, the fewer support you will have for public policy. So if you were to suggest or to offer a policy to citizens that will deliver benefits in 40 years, the level of support will be significantly lower than, say, in 5 years. So in this conjoint experiment that I submitted, I did ask citizens to rank policies that will yield like good outcomes in 5 years, 20 years, and 40 years, and you see a drastic decrease in public support. 68% of the policies that would deliver positive outcome in 5 years. So 68% of respondents favor these policies. For policies that will deliver outcome in 20 years, it's 52%, and for 40 years, it's 41% of respondents who favor it. So there's a clear problem right here. Support drops sharply as the time horizon extends. So the key finding here is that the more people think about like the temporal dimension of policies, the less support they will have. And when you ask qualitatively, when you interview citizens, when you ask them in focus groups or in mini-publics, which is a method that I use quite often in my research, about why that is the case, they tend to think, well, I don't really care about future generations. Even if I have children, even if I have grandchildren, I still think that I deserve some results from politicians who I elect myself. So that is part of the problem, not only from a politician's perspective, but also when it comes to public opinion. At the same time, and that's where things get interesting, they do recognize that long-term policy issues need to be addressed. So climate change, housing, social inequalities came as the top 3 issues that the Australian society faces now and needs to be tackled by governments now. Which is quite interesting because these 3 issues have a long-term dimension. You can't build houses in 1 year. You can't have a complete new housing development set up even in 5 years, because the housing crisis in Australia is a systemic issue. Climate change is a well-known creeping crisis, and so is social inequalities as well. So most of the challenges that were identified by Australian citizens in the survey are long-term by nature. However, governments still respond with short-term fixes. And the survey, now comparing the 10 countries covered in the survey, also demonstrates that there's a strong public mandate for long-termism. Some of the key striking findings, in my view, is that 62% of the respondents agree that there is too much political competition for long-term solutions, that politics come into the long-term problem, like do not contribute to long-term positions. 67% say that an electoral term is not enough for long-term planning, which we all agree, I believe. 74% reject the idea that the world changes too fast for long-term decisions, and therefore that the short cycle of crisis is not an excuse to avoid thinking about long-term issues. And 66% of respondents say that elected officials should not prioritize the current situation over future generations. So there seems to be, in this representative sample of 10 countries, a strong public mandate for long-termism. Another crucial element to keep in mind, I've already touched upon this matter, is a trust deficit in governance. Trust in national governments in the survey is very low. It's below the 5 points average. However, citizens tend to trust more scientists, they trust more courts and public servants as well. And this gap also has an impact on the implementation of long-term policies. That is also one of the reasons why respondents in the survey did not believe that long-term policies that will yield an impact in 20 and 40 years will actually be well implemented, because they don't trust the national government. And when you have a look at the European Union, which is what I mostly study in the survey and in my research, we do see that citizens endorse long-term governance at the European Union level, not only because they trust Brussels, not because they trust Brussels absolutely, so Brussels being like the headquarters of the European Union, but because they trust it more than their own national institutions. So when policies are being proposed at the European Union level away from the domestic challenges that one may face, the domestic political challenges, then that yields more support for implementing this policy, even if it yields a long-term public benefit, if you like. There is a little bit of a geographical component that I'm going to very briefly touch upon, which is that if countries are situated at the periphery of the European Union, then they are more willing to get the European Union to step in and to suggest long-term solutions to policy problems. While if they are close to the core power of the European Union, think of countries like Germany, France, Italy, or the Netherlands, their support for long-term policies at the European Union level varies quite a little bit. So what does it mean if we go beyond the so-called Eurocentric approach? It's actually a phenomenon that we can observe in other countries, including in Australia. When there is a low level of trust in national institutions, then citizens may look to other levels of governance to implement long-term policies. Think of the regional level, or think of international bodies that can support, recommend, or advise policies that will yield benefits in the long term. Many countries recognize that long-term policymaking is a problem, and that something ought to be done about this. And we've seen some countries implementing a series of experiments, be it institutions or events, or simply even like research projects or research programs, to try and get both policymakers and the public to think about the long term and to bring back the future into the decisions made today. We've seen some countries implementing a so-called parliamentary committee for the future. What does that mean? It basically means that a group of members of the parliament at the national level will be part of a committee to think about the implications of public policies enacted by national parliaments in the future. So if they were to support, say, cutting taxes at the national level now, what would be the impact on the economy and on the society in 15, 20, 25, even 40 years' time? And this committee has been particularly successful in countries such as Finland, Chile, and Lithuania, with members of the parliament saying that it equips them well to be all-rounders in politics, to think about the long term. One of the most famous members of parliament in Finland, who was a member of the Parliamentary Committee for the Future at the beginning of her career, is Sanna Marin, who is former Prime Minister of Finland. Other countries and other nations, in the case of Wales, have gone for another type of institution to bring the long term back into the present, in a way. It's the Future Generations Commissioners. It's basically like an ombudsperson who is in charge of assessing the government programs and the impact that these government programs have for the long run. In Wales, it's been particularly successful and institutionalized, meaning that since 2015, each government program is being assessed by this Future Generations Commissioner and provides a series of recommendations in a report to bring the long term back into the program where needed be. Hungary is quite of an interesting context because it was set up in 2008 and then dismantled by the Orban government when it came in power. Interestingly, Hungary has just had an election, and you've seen probably that Viktor Orban, who was prime minister for 16 years, has just lost the election, which has significant consequences at the European level. Other countries have established strategic foresight units, which is like a formal level of public service where strategies established by entities such as the European Commission or in Singapore, like the government of Singapore, to think about the economic and social consequences of specific public policy packages. Other countries have established independent fiscal councils, and others have established citizens' assemblies, which is probably the most informal way of thinking long term. Citizens' assemblies have been criticized for not leading to actual change. My perspective is that citizens' assemblies actually should be used as a tool by governments, by politicians, to try and understand how people, the citizens, and therefore the voters, think of the long-term impact of their decisions. So it's bridging the gap, the trust gap between citizens and elected representatives. Here are some examples of these institutions. I will just highlight also something that has happened in the European Union fairly recently in 2019, which is establishing a ministerial, if you like, portfolio for foresight. So the Vice President of the European Commission is in charge of producing an annual strategic foresight report to steer EU policy direction and make sure that it follows the long-term objectives of the European Union, with one of the key objectives of the European Union being to become the first carbon neutral continent by 2050 with the implementation of the so-called European Green Deal, which is lagging behind, unsurprisingly, given the crises that we have seen, such as Russia's invasion of Ukraine and most recently the war in Iran, which may also have lead to delays in the implementation of the European Green Deal. So now let's talk a little bit about Indonesia. First, a disclaimer on this. I am not an expert on Indonesia, right? So I just wanted to talk a little bit about where this research is situated and how this can be implemented at the Indonesian level. And I think that having had discussions with many colleagues who work on Indonesia, one of the key elements where we can investigate long-term policymaking in Indonesia is the politics of critical minerals. So Indonesia itself offers a compelling case study for long-term policymaking. It controls roughly 60% of the world's mined nickel supply and 45% of its processing as well. And since the 2009 mining law, and most particularly the 2020 nickel export ban as well, the country has pursued a deliberate downstream processing strategy to move away from raw extraction to building an integrated EV supply chain, which is a long-term industrial policy. However, this is only one part of the equation of thinking long-term. You have a long-term industrial policy goal, yielding to growth, but that does not translate to long-term governance. You need to have strategic foresight to complement this long-term industrial policy as well, to anticipate multiple scenarios and to meet the core objectives set up by the government. In other words, you need to have a body, an institution. You could have a commissioner for future generations, for instance, to try and monitor the impact of this long-term industrial policy. And you did mention a bit earlier about Indonesia Vision 2045, which I was very interested to hear about. So again, this is very much to open up the discussion later, and I very much hope that there will be some comments and questions about how we can together try to foster long-term policy making in Indonesia. But these are the 4 core pillars of Indonesia Vision 2045: human development and the mastery of science and technology, sustainable economic development, equitable development, strengthening national resilience, and governance. These are very broad pillars and very broad objectives, and it's not that Indonesia and the Indonesian government is responsible for setting up 2 broad guidelines. Everybody does it. Like the Sustainable Development Goals set up by the United Nations go in the same direction. They have very broad objectives to think about the future, but it is very difficult to translate them to concrete policy action, and they can be interpreted in multiple ways. How can governments be held accountable to follow this vision? That is the problem, and it's very much subject to interpretation. So if you do not have a body, an independent body or an institution to monitor whether progress is being made towards these goals, then you face some issues when it comes to realizing these long-term visions, which are far from being new. We've seen these kind of programs emerging already in the 1980s across the world. So what can we do to hold leaders accountable for the future? What work can we do as citizens, as public servants, as academics, as students, as researchers, to bring the long term back into the equation and remind politicians that they should not only think about the short term and their personal professional goals as well? First thing is to demand accountability. One way to do this is to raise our voices and to take part in communities or committees that help demonstrate that citizens care about the long run. That unlike what governments and politicians think, citizens want to see concrete actions made in the long run. These are good indicators for governments, and that would make them realize that they can go beyond the short-term policies, such as cutting taxes, as we've seen at the very beginning. The second element is to support institutions that bring the long term back into the game, such as the Committees for Future Generations, or a Futures Ombudsman, or Futures Commissioners, strategic foresight, advisory boards, you name it. The creation of these institutions, even if they don't have a decision-making power, will play an important role in reminding those in charge that the consequences of their actions will have an impact in the long run. The third way we can hold leaders accountable for the future is to reframe the debate. That long-term investment is not a cost, but it's the foundation of prosperity for society as well. And the data from the survey that I presented shows that citizens already understand this, but the political class should not overlook the long term. So to conclude, 4 key takeaways from this lecture. The first thing is that short-termism is structural, but this should not be the norm. It is not inevitable. There can be some ways to overcome the short-termist aspect of societies, such as like short-term election cycles, the short-term crises that always appear, but institutions can overcome political myopia if we tackle this correctly. We do also see in the research that I conduct that citizens across 10 countries support long-term governance, and that the problem is politics. It's not public opinion, unlike many politicians believe. Anticipatory institutions, in my view, is one of the key demonstrated evidence-based solutions to this problem. And I'm not saying again that there should be a new institution that will overlook or that will judge and overthrow, that's the word that I was looking for, the decisions made by ministries. It can be merely purely advisory. They can act as advisory boards to remind governments and ministries of the impact of their decisions for the future, especially for future generations. And finally, when it comes to Indonesia, which I hope will be like the start of a discussion for us, the critical mineral strategy shows that a long-term vision is possible, but it must be paired with governance that delivers for all. So there's still a missing block, a missing piece here that needs to be considered, not only in the context of Indonesian governance, but also beyond. Terima kasih. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. So it is very interesting that it looks like we are trained to be thinking short-term, like every point of junctures creates habits that affects how people think what is long-term, and what is short-term. And this very confusion creates some venomous cycle and trap inside the electoral trap that you mentioned. And I wonder how trust matters in this venomous cycle that you mentioned, Bob. And the perspective has shifted also, from the future to be crisis is like swept under the rug. Okay. For further discussion, I think I would like to invite some of the questions from the floor. Okay, already 2 raise your hand, and I think 1 more from Zoom, if there's any. So if there's a time, I will open the discussion later. So the first is from Mr. I think we have. Thank you, Mr. Lukman. Please announce yourself, mention your name, if you're a student, mention your class and affiliation, please.
Okay. First of all, thank you so much for the opportunity, University of Indonesia, to allow me to be here today. Hello, Professor. Greetings. I hope your first visit to Indonesia will delight you so much because we have a lot to offer. Greetings. My name is Bernhard Faras. I just graduated from Tsinghua University in China for the Master of Public Administrations. And also my bachelor degree is in Information Technology and Project Management in the Fachhochschule Südwestfalia, German. And currently I'm looking for a PhD. And I'm looking for Australia for my PhD. So it's interesting to see about the future because many of us, especially youth, doesn't think that there will be a future. In my opinion, in my personal opinion. So first, please enlighten us, Professor. Is the fiscal policy is the biggest constraint regarding the government to see the long terms. Because like, not only about electoral, but if you see in Indonesian governments, we have like a yearly budgeting, right? So they are focused to how to like use all the budgets. Even it's unnecessary, just use it. So they can increase the budget next year, right? And the second one is, you mentioned on your lectures, which is, there is some people that doesn't really think about the futures. That's what I get. So if the medical accelerations, like let's say, oh, people can live for 60 or 70 years now, right? But if there is a medical breakthrough that can make us live for 200 or 300 years, is it will change your research significantly or not, in your assumption? And then the last one is like about AI, because my background is about AI and my master thesis is about digital sovereignty. And based on my research, it really enables us to see the future governments easily because there is a predictive AI, right? But, so in your opinion, does the government just choose to not to enables it or adopt it, or is it natural, or is it political? I think that's all from me. Thank you.
Yeah, Ben, I think you just answered because it's a very complex question, right?
Yeah, yes.
Yeah, please.
Thank you so much. And first of all, congratulations on graduating from your master's program, and I wish you all the very best for your PhD. We can have a conversation after to see how we can help, or if I can help you at all. These are three really good and interesting questions that you raised. The first one being about fiscal policy. Yes, the answer is yes. It plays a big role in short-termism, and that's not only something that we see. So in Indonesia, you said that they just operate on a one-year cycle, and they seek at using all of the budget, but that's the case in many democracies around the world as well. I'm not going to say there are solutions to this. Of course, like the longer the budgetary term, the better in terms of planning policies. But to the best of my knowledge, you do not have any democracies where there is a budget planned for the long term. So that means like beyond electoral cycles. You have budgets set up for 5 years, maybe 7 years at best, but they do not go beyond the electoral cycle. So that's something that may be considered as well. Like, again, throwing ideas here, being completely utopian, you could imagine that budget surplus could be invested towards the future as well. Your second question on like health improvements and imagining that citizens would live like 100 or 200 years old, which I very much like, and whether that would yield like some changes. My gut would tell me that yes, it would change the perspective, because then citizens would see that in 40 years' time they would benefit or suffer from the decisions made today by politicians. There's a clear, I'm going to be blunt here with the use of my language, there's a clear selfish rationale in the way people think about decisions. However, in the survey, we do see that issues such as climate change, aging population, so long-term creeping crises need to be addressed, even with the current life expectancy of citizens. So there's a bit of like a mixed answer here to your question, but I would imagine that people would think even more long-term if the life expectancy was to be higher. And finally, when it comes to artificial intelligence, the $1 million or the trillion Indonesian rupiah question, I think that like governments around the world face a bit of a dilemma on whether to let business and companies run their course in terms of development or regulating it immediately. I think that there's a little bit too much of a backseat being taken by governments as well, because the rise of new technologies, especially so artificial intelligence, will and has already started transforming societies. There will be needs for retraining some workers, and that will yield additional costs for government to provide these education opportunities, be it just to learn how to use AI properly in a job or to retrain people whose jobs have been replaced by artificial intelligence. We have seen this in the past. This is not a new phenomenon with the automation of some tasks as well. But the scale of the impact that artificial intelligence will have on the labor market is unprecedented. And therefore, it does require action now rather than taking the back seat and see how things are going to evolve in the private sector. I hope that answers your questions.
Then the governance will naturally perform the structural altruism. So from those scenarios that will be happen. So I think the second question is from Abdul. So please rise and ask your question. I think it's very few because you have history to question long question.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Dr. Benjamin, for your presentation. First of all, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Abdul Karim Yanda from the United Republic of Tanzania. I'm a master student of administrative science from University of Indonesia, Faculty of Administrative Science. I'm so happy for your presentation, and I have one question is two sections. Question number one is I want to know why the government, there is a low trust left, trust to the community or the citizen, but what does the government can do to restore the trust to the citizen? But also question number two, I want to know does it democracy also itself require the short-term plan focus more to remain responsive to the voters or not? If yes, why? You get my point?
Can you please repeat that question? I got the first one perfectly. But the second one,
question number two, I want to know, does it democracy itself require a short-term plans focus to the plan to remain responsive to the voters or to the community?
All right, got it. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you very much, Abdul.
I think the first question is low public trust. Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, and how to reimagine how government will fix that. I think it's not on the government side, but And the second is how to deal with the voters and in a short-term, policy in the short honeymoon period that you mentioned. Yeah. I think
Yes.
so. Please.
Yes, thank you very much, Abdul, for these great questions as well. When it comes to the first one, in terms of rebuilding trust, that's something that many societies have been struggling with, and there's no perfect equation, there's no perfect solution to this. I think that it's very context dependent. I'm going to be very broad here, because also I cannot provide an answer to the Indonesian context, but accountability, transparency have been seen in other contexts as the two key qualities that will lead citizens to trust their governments further. So rather than breaking promises or making backdoor deals, or just citizens wondering where is the money, broadly speaking, is just being transparent about how things go, and also being clear when there are complex issues that do not lead to clear-cut solutions or immediate solutions. Being clear when a society faces some strong problems and not taking citizens as ignorance of the problems. So basically treating them as equals to decision makers in a way. That is quite broad because there is no perfect solution to rebuilding the trust gap, and that's why many societies, including in Europe, in the countries that I've studied, are still struggling with the rise of populism and Eurosceptic political parties. When it comes to your second question, I'm afraid I don't have an answer. How can we incentivize them? That's a very good question. I think when it comes to these kind of questions, the number one answer that I would provide, again, that is quite broad, is education. It's about teaching students, teaching children about the importance to plan ahead. And some schools do it very well when it comes to personal decisions, like economic, financial decisions as well. Thinking about planning for your retirement when you start working from a young age, for instance. thinking about saving money, maybe the same can be done for public policy making as well, knowing that the governments, the public sector, is there to deliver a common good, a common public good, and therefore making decisions as citizens to favor the long term will yield a good impact as it does when you invest or save money from a young age for when you get a little bit older as well. So education may be one of the answers.
Yes. Yeah, I think trust matters. Yeah, because otherwise we don't have any legitimation from the constituent. Right? But I think in Indonesia, the distrust that happens towards the public sector or government is projected toward community governance. That I think this engagement of power creates more safer space for the community or people. Yeah. Yeah, I think for the next, I would like to invite perhaps Mas Ichan to really comment on these topics or any microphone to.
Baik, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Ben, we have met in 2016 in University of Canberra when you were in ICPA with Mark Turner.
Oh, yes.
Yes, we were
See you
there
again.
for first double degree with University of Canberra. Yes. Yeah. But at that time you were with beer.
I have to look younger now.
And I were slim. Now I'm wealthy man.
People will change. Yeah.
People change. So I rather to call you Ben.
Yes, yeah, of
Okay.
course.
The title of our lecture is Why Government Can't Think Long Term. And how can we do about it, solve about this problem. But I think you don't have to solve this problem. Maybe it is the context that politics and administrations have to deal about this kind of situation. Indonesia always have long-term plan. Since the era of Suharto regimes, we have long-term planning, and now we also have long-term planning.
Yeah.
And since the political reform in 1999, we had two documents of long-term planning. Now we are in the second, the 2025 up to 2045. That's Indonesian Emas, Indonesian Golden. But when we try to ensure that long-term planning can be accomplished in 5 years, which is also related to the political electoral system. We change the president, minister, and so on and so forth. The question is, do we need still think about the long term? How about the uncertainty conditions? Because at the end, the politician, ministers think about 5 years. When they think about long term, then the question is, I only have 5 years, and if I could win the second term, only 10 years. And a lot of this program about climate change, about poverty, dealing with poverty, more than 10 years. Somehow, this kind of situation is exploited by the politician to say that that's why you have to choose me again for the next term, because I have not yet finished my program.
Yes. Classic.
So when we say that, oh, you are deliver poor performance, then they will say that, yes, because it's only 5 years. This program, social program, need more than 5 years. So this kind of issue in national level, maybe we can say it's about discourse. But when we talk at the local level, then the context is different. So when we talk about social welfare program, what the government thinks is how to make it happen. The result is just a very, let's say, clear-cut program, give subsidy. Everything see now in our government because we want to deal with the poverty, but we have only limited time, 5 years, then all goes the money for the poverty for like, and so on and so forth. Yeah, regional know everything. So this is now that we dealing about Indonesian today. Not, we don't have to talk about 2045 because we also believe that once the, let's say, the electoral turnover create a new government, then the next government have have the vision and mission that can be delivered totally different with the previous president or government. Although they will say that, yes, we followed the 20 years plan. So then this has become the political hustle-bustle in the parliament because you see that we have to follow this 25 years plan, but we have a very limited time and so on and so forth. And then the tendency that once the government hold the power, then they will try to ensure that the poverty could be dealt with many necessaries. And with the scar of resources, we believe that there are some program could be, say, diminished or maybe postponed. So this is, I think, the way politicians deal with kind of situation. So that's why I think this is not something that we have to deal with, but this is a discourse for us to see whatever the accountability and how that the next generations could get benefit from the policy today.
Yeah.
That's I think what we have to think about. Thank you.
That's
Thank you.
very gazillion question, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah. Do we even need to think long term?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good point that you raise. Like, do we actually need to do that? Or is it just performative as well? Is it just discursive and it's all about saying, oh, look, we are thinking about the future of the society? That could be like a very good, like strong counter argument to what is suggested in the presentation, which is, okay, if we want to have, like to think about the future of societies, then we need to have institutions or we need to have actors that hold governments accountable. That's something that could be experimented as well in some countries, absolutely. But for now, if we keep on going with these like strategic long-term visions and we want to be serious about it, then we need to demonstrate that we go beyond performance. Just talking words will only have a negative impact on public trust towards government. It contributes to one of those many promises broken by subsequent governments all around the world. So either you go for the pragmatic option, which is we're just going to deliver in the short term for this election, and we discard the future, and we will say that things will improve on their own because we all want to operate for the common good, or we will implement a long-term vision, we will delegate some of our powers or provide strong advisory powers to an institution or to a body or a set of actors, and we will be held properly accountable for the decisions that we make to see whether or not they align with these long-term strategies that we want to implement. So both options are totally viable, but the status quo as it is right now is just unsustainable to me.
I think, is that answer, question? Okay. Another question, I think I will give the opportunity to the Zoom. I think I will give to the Master of Ceremony to let the one of the first question from the Zoom, ya?
Yeah.
Okay.
We have time for approximately one more question. Untuk Saudara Fikri Nufian Pratama yang sudah raise hand, kami persilakan untuk memberi pertanyaannya. Silakan di unmute.
So Mr. Fikri, so please to open your sound. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. First of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Fikri Nufian Pratama. I have one question for Dr. Ben. If we gave the future a legal seat in the table today, would our current law be enough to protect it, or do we first need a total revolution in how citizens are politically educated to care about someone who doesn't exist in parliament? That's all my question. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for your comment. Yeah, in terms of education, there is clearly a need to do this. This should be actually like the number one priority, I believe, to like get citizens to think about the long term in general, and then like education programs always yield benefits in general, and it's not only for political decisions; it's also for their personal decisions that can be made as well. So. To me, education is almost always the solution. That's it. Like without being too strict, of course, in terms of the content, but just like getting people to think about the future generally. So also something that I do not mention for the sake of time and because this survey is incredibly complex, is that there are some questions that are related to their personal views towards the future and other questions about their views towards the, like political long-termism. So the conscious choice to prioritize long-term policies over the short-term ones. And when it comes to these individual stances as well, there's a clear correlation between the way people think about long-term policies and the way they think about their individual future. So one of the questions is about whether they often think about what they will be like when they retire. And the people that display the lowest level of thinking about the future are also the ones that favor short-term policies the most. So there's a clear correlation here between the way they think about the future from a personal perspective and the way they think the government should think about the future, which is logical, I would say.
We have many more time or 3 minutes? I think one question. Yeah. I think from student from the back to the undergraduates, if there's any question from you. This is your future policy analyst. Come on. Ayo, ada yang mau tanya? Oke, Zoom aja. Oke, one more from Zoom meeting. I think who's the second fastest? Oh, yeah.
We have one question from chat from Ayu Arini from the Ministry of Population and Family Development. Two questions, in fact. Question number one, to what extent does building institutional capacity for long-term policy foresight depend on a well-established research and development ecosystem? In contexts where R&D capacity is still weak or unevenly distributed, particularly at the community level or maybe the government. Are there any alternative mechanisms or adaptive strategies that the governments can use to develop meaningful long-term policy foresight in that context? That's question number one regarding R&D. Question number two, in many cases, governments are still struggling to set clear policy priorities. In that context, how can they start incorporating long-term thinking for future generations without losing focus on immediate needs, such as urgent socioeconomic ones? Is there a framework or a principle that can prevent this trade-off from becoming a zero-sum conflict? Those are the two questions from Ayu Arini.
You can relate to this question, yeah. It's really difficult. Please.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you very much. These are like really, really good questions. I'll start with the second one. I mean, there are multiple mechanisms that have been implemented to try and bring like long-term back into the game. Again, it's very much context dependent. So I'm not going to say that one solution in one country that works in one country will work in another country in this context, like Indonesia. So yet it is worth experimenting with. One of the parameters or one of the mechanisms that have been implemented in some countries and levels of government, thinking about the European Union as well, is having conferences on the future or citizens' assemblies where selected citizens who can be representative of a said population, it's easier to do it at the local level, to be honest, or who are mostly representative of, say, like younger generations, are invited by the government to reflect on the so-called creeping crises that we talked about here, so climate change, aging society, or whatever. In these settings, for the citizens' assemblies, how does it go? You have citizens who are briefed about a topic. They learn about the problem faced by the government and the problem the government wants to address in the long run. They hear from experts, and here the notion of expert is quite important because, as we've seen in the slide, experts, be it like academics, scientists, practitioners who have a long-standing reputation, are by large more trusted than the governments to, like in general. So these experts provide some context on the matter. And then citizens brainstorm, discuss, deliberate, and ultimately vote on a series of policy recommendations that could then be taken into account by the government to solve this problem. This principle, this mechanism that is like a deliberative strategy, has many benefits to me. Number one, it tends to address the trust divide between citizens and elected representatives. And number two, it opens the box beyond beyond politicians and beyond the public sector as well. So you can think of it as a way to try and reconcile different visions about the future. But this can be purely done on an advisory basis. The first question I'm afraid I forget. Like, would you mind, Verdi, repeating the first question?
The first question is regarding R&D, specifically to what extent does building institutional capacity for long-term policy foresight depend on a well-established research and development ecosystem?
Yes, that's a good one. It does depend quite a lot about it. However, you always need to have a starting point to have a sustainable ecosystem as well. So there's a point where there needs to be like a change that occurs, and this change can be incremental as well. You can start at a small scale, you can experiment, you can try and introduce long-term elements in specific elements of a policy area, a ministry, and then see whether it yields the expected outcome. So it's all about incrementalism, broadly speaking. That's the short answer I would give.
Slow at a time, right?
Yes, exactly. Baby steps.
Yeah, baby steps. So I think I will have one more question from Zoom meeting from Mr. Sutikno. Please, Mr. Sutikno, to open your camera and sound, and please ask directly to the band. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. You can hear me? Okay?
Yes, very clear.
Okay. Thank you, moderator, and thanks, Ben, for your presentation. My name is Sutikno, and I'm a doctoral student at the National Institute of Public Administration, Jakarta. And I did my master's degree at the Crawford School of Public Policy, ANU, in Canberra. My research right now is about the old age pension in Indonesia, especially as long-term response to the population aging. And I see this as a very relevant because Indonesia still its demographic bonus period, but at the same time, the country is moving forward, an aging society. So the policy challenges is clearly long-term. That's it why your point about the structural short-term is really struck me. And my view, old age pension is exactly the kind of policy where government need to act earlier, even though the benefits are mostly long-term and often politically less visible in the short run. And for Indonesia, this is matter for the long-term ambition of Indonesia Emas because the demographic bonus will not automatically translate into welfare gains unless the country is prepared for aging. No, so I would like to ask if short-term is structural, so what institutional design can help lock it long-term state commitment to older pension policy, because especially for informal worker and vulnerable group with weak political and political representative, because you know that there is no much channel for the informal worker to to present ideas and to get the attention to politic or to government to get their problem. So that's all for my question. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question, and also, yeah, aging population is clearly one of those creeping crises that like almost like all societies face indeed. When it comes to the institutional design, I mean, there are multiple ways this is being tackled. Like in Australia, I understand that you've worked also like in Australia, right, on the matter. So there's the Foundation for Tomorrow that has been quite successful in lobbying to establish something that is fairly similar, or at the very least inspired by the Parliamentary Committee for the Future, which aims at making politicians, elected representatives, think about the future. Again, when it comes to setting up a new institution, it's very much context dependent, and it, most importantly, it depends on the willingness of those in power to introduce these changes that will make people or politicians think more about the long term. In general, and that's a normal trend, like politicians, governments would be reluctant to get rid of some of their power, or to have another body that would kind of like constrain their actions, or that would hold them more accountable on the decisions that they make. And that's the reason why some of these institutions have been unsuccessful in reintroducing or putting the long term back in at the center of the political agenda. So it is very much context dependent. My view is that, again, incrementalism is the best way to operate. There is no universal solution that, or one size fits all solution that will work across all societies, that will work with all ideologies, with all political parties in power, obviously. Citizens have an important role to play, I believe, also in making sure that their voices are heard one way or another. But introducing institutions that means that the long term is taken into account beyond a specific electoral cycle, and that will hold governments to a certain extent accountable in the form of advisory groups or reports on their policies, is a very important stepping stone towards thinking about the long run. That's the idea.
Yeah.
So the answer, in short, is it depends, I'm afraid.
So thank you, Ben, and thank you, Mr. Sutikno. I think we are at the near of a session. I'm sorry to you ask a question that I cannot accommodate all you. So I think to sum it up, because this is about the balancing. It's about how we connect the mandate that at risk, and to balance between the bureaucratic inertia, between the public institution that happens to be controlling our long-term development plan, but we need to have the quick wins between short-term policies that affect people and benefit people the most. Yeah, I think that's your problem. If you have any, you have policymakers here and policy analysts here. That's not our problem, but it's your problem. Okay. Yeah, I think that's it. I will give back to our moderator, Mr. Firdi. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ben, and I will see you backstage.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ben and Mas Rijal, for the enlightening answers and pleasant discussions. I hope we can learn much from your expertise. Next, we would like to hand over a token of appreciation from us at the faculty. To present our token of appreciation, I invite our Dean, Professor Retno, to come to the stage and hand over our token. We kindly invite also the documentation team to come forward and take photos. Before we conclude today's public lecture, I would like to inform all internship partners, alumni, and students of the University of Melbourne that there will be an informal tea time discussion taking place at the Smart Classroom on the 3rd floor. We humbly invite you to attend if you are available. As we have reached the end of today's event, we extend our sincere gratitude to all speakers, honored guests, and participants, both online and offline, for joining us at today's public lecture. We deeply appreciate the knowledge shared with us today by our distinguished guest, Dr. Benjamin Leruth, and our moderator, Mas Rijal. Before we leave, we also have the attendance form displayed here on screen. So if all participants, both online and offline, could kindly scan the QR code or go to the link to fill the attendance form. For online participants, this attendance form is also a requirement for you to receive your digital signature, so please do not forget to fill it out. On behalf of the Faculty of Administrative Science, Universitas Indonesia, we are honored to have hosted this public lecture, reflecting our commitment to the sharing of knowledge and the fostering of academic collaboration. We hope this lecture provides both insights and inspiration for everyone attending today. Thank you once again, and have a wonderful rest of the day.